If we do want to create an Australia that is thriving and prosperous and healthy and Australians protected and safe, have good well-being, then we need to look at a range of global things that could happen and think about how we can shift to being proactive on those matters, rather than just treating the future as something that hurtles towards us like an asteroid out of our control.
I'm Dr. Louise Massara, and this is the Future Health Podcast. In 2045, we will need solutions to problems that haven't yet been imagined. But that will require the freedom to think about a truly novel future. In a world increasingly more reliant on AI tools than human imagination, how can we train ourselves to think about a future without being hamstrung by the past? And how does moving from conceiving of a probable to a possible future change the way we make decisions today? Will Hartigan is an expert in strategic foresight or futures. He most recently led the Policy Fit for the Future project at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Will has a wide breadth of policy experience with a focus on the innovation, geopolitical, entrepreneurship and technology policy spaces. It's not in his bio, but he's also a fast talker. So hold on to your hats. Welcome, Will. So Will, the pace of change right now sort of feels like it's coming at us, it's relentless. But I wonder what your views are. Is this really a unique period of transformation?
I think this is the big question, right? It's very hard for me to say, what we're going through right now is maybe worse than perhaps what Western Europe was going through in 1939. We've seen things like air travel, televisions being invented, microwave, the complete change of gender and race relations over the last 100 years. So it is difficult saying whether it stacks up. I will say that what I think is fundamentally different about now to any other prime moment in human history is the interconnectedness of the entire global system. And this is the way we can see things cascade across the entire globe, not just with COVID or a big crisis like that, but also what we see happening with music, with political ideas, with new technologies and the way they cascade quickly across the world. And I think it's the combo of that, the complete speed at which things can accelerate and cascade globally, which is one defining feature of our current world. I think the other one is we actually know more about what's coming down the pipe in the future than any other generation in the entirety of human history. If you look at climate change, we may not know the specifics and the details, but we know the temperature's going to get warmer, for example, and there's going to be a lot of disasters, natural effects on communities. No one's ever had that kind of insight about what's coming down the pipe in terms of big global changes over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. And I think the other one we can see that being true for is data. We've never had so much both human knowledge that anyone can access on their phone instantly, through Wikipedia or through Google. You can access almost everything that we know in the sciences and the arts and literature, and that is compounding and building every single year. So those are the two big things I think make the current moment particularly difficult to manage. We've got this immense uncertainty on one hand by how interconnected and complex the world is, but at the same time we have this huge awareness of big challenges coming down the pipe that we need to grapple with. And I think that combo is uniquely paralytic sometimes for us.
So interesting. Well, you've said sort of 20, 30, 40 years. I want to talk to you a little bit about horizons. So if we're going to talk a little bit about sort of future planning and looking at solutions for the future, is there a sort of optimal horizon when we're thinking about possibility and creativity?
So I think ideally we'd be looking decades, hundreds of years down the pipe even. I mean, in terms of what we want to achieve, in terms of what we want to build the country towards, we know we've got challenges in infrastructure and our systems which need that almost multi-generational lens. I've got young kids. I'm very concerned with what their life over the next 100 years for them is going to look like. But at a pragmatic level, I think particularly working in government, but also when we do futures or strategic foresight exercises with other organisations, we find 10 years is a really good lens to look at. Because if you look at every 10 years over the 20th century or the last 100 years, we've seen enormous amounts of change, right? We see every 10 years there tends to be a new war, a financial crisis, some kind of health crisis, but also a new technology that's been invented. You can look at the growth of the internet in the 90s and then the smartphones and the iPhone and social media, and we find 10 years chunks is about where people can understand that major change is happening in that time frame, but it's pretty proximate to where we're living right now, right? If I knew something big was going to happen in the next 10 years, I'd want to be thinking about it with some degree of urgency, I think, whereas that's not the case for 50. The flip side is, if I'm only looking at the next 12 months, I'm probably not willing to accept the amount of change that could happen in the world. And we've obviously seen an incredible amount of change in the United States recently over the last 12 months. And I think that the fallacy which we want to kind of address is that there are lots of kinds of change which could happen imminently, immediately, but to get that creative thinking about what could be about to occur, we do have to push that time horizon a little bit. So we say 10 years is about the sweet spot.
Can I challenge you on that? I wonder whether 10 years, it means we're talking about our own futures. I wonder how creative people can be when it's their own environment that we're going to impact. Versus if we give people a little bit of a longer horizon where that's not going to impact their role, their job, their career, does that open things up for people, and are people more prepared to consider a broader set of alternatives when they themselves aren't going to sort of be at the brunt of it?
No, absolutely. Look, I think here's the thing. You push further out the time horizon and you just accept a wider range of outcomes. I mean, this is the problem with all predictive models, whether we have them in economics or science. The further out we push, the more the uncertainty just becomes irreducible and the predictive power becomes weaker. The flip side, as he says, allows us to imagine much more dramatic changes. One thing I often think about was if we're thinking about one of the biggest changes in the entire world and potentially in all of human history that's happened pretty recently, it's been the changes in China and the rise of their middle class. If you think about billions of people and their lives fundamentally changing over a 15 or 20-year period, it kind of demonstrates you can do things over that space in time. Can we envisage a transformation, not of the same kind, but of similar scope here in Australia? Yes, you probably would need to push that thinking out to 20 or 30 years because it seems impossible. So look, I agree. It's a balancing act, right? Like, I think that's the key thing. And I find that the problem often with this kind of work in a government or institutional context is convincing people that they need to engage now, and sometimes that means you need to also drag the time horizons forward to catalyse action.
Let's just define for people that aren't familiar with the space, what is strategic foresight?
Strategic foresight is not a new discipline. It started out actually in the sort of thinking that went on post-World War II about how to prepare for nuclear war, right?
Okay.
But it got adapted into something that first energy companies started using and then governments all around the world. So look, the concept of foresight itself isn't new, right? Like there's lots of attempts to look ahead and think about how we use that ever since probably humans discovered fire, right? So like I tend to use the term futures as a way to wrap that up because there's a lot of other cool stuff that is being explored at the fringes of this. One of the things though that I would say most people familiar with this space would see being part of strategic foresight is horizon scanning, where we're going and looking at the future and thinking about what kind of disruptive changes are on the horizon that could impact our ability to thrive, prosper if it's government, as Australian people. The other thing is scenarios. So scenarios actually came out of Hollywood originally, and they got adopted into this, but I'm sure we've all heard about economic scenarios, and these came from these initial forays into foresight, which was really looked at as scenarios-based exercise, and that comes from, unlike forecasting, which is about how do we predict what's going to happen, strategic foresight's key axiom is that we can't predict exactly what's going to happen, so we need to consider a range of possible futures if we want our plans to be successful. So in government, that means if we do want to create an Australia that is thriving and prosperous and healthy and where Australians are protected and safe, have good well-being, then we need to look at a range of global things that could happen and think about how we can shift to being proactive on those matters, rather than just treating the future as something that hurtles towards us like an asteroid out of our control. It's reminding people that we have control, that our future is largely going to be created by other people on the planet with whom we have influence over. So whether it be how AI is going to change our jobs or whether it's going to how we adapt to climate change, these are all things that we have to make in terms of decisions, either to do something or do nothing. So that's fundamentally about what can change and what actions can we take today to shape and influence that change.
So how sophisticated is the Australian government's use or application of futures?
So obviously when I say Australian government, I'll think federally, but the state governments also have a range of amazing efforts in this space. The New South Wales government has a fantastic team shaping Futures New South Wales. So there's a lot of teams that do this work. It has always been particularly strong in intelligence and defence. You've possibly heard of wargaming type exercises they run, and obviously when they're thinking about long-term procurement, they have to think about different scenarios in that way. What's always been a little bit more challenging has been getting it to work in other policy spaces, and this is a problem across the entire OECD. So I led this project, Policy Fit for the Future, which was about uplifting and sort of establishing this capability more across the Australian government. And what I've seen consistently is there's a recognition, as you mentioned at the start of this, that we live in very uncertain time, turbulent times, and that we need more of this kind of work. I think the what is very clearly established, it's just the how sometimes that we're continuing to iterate and work on.
So you talked about a range of possible futures, and that is the sort of the difference between forecasting, if you like, and foresight. Can you talk to us a little bit about that sort of space of probable, possible, plausible future?
Yeah, so the way I like to think about this is we have this superpower already to imagine the future. Like, I've already decided what I'm going to do when I win lotto, right? Yeah. I absolutely daydreamed about that, right? So I think that our superpower is that we not only think about the future, we think about how we think about the future. right? But the downside of that superpower, which is something animals don't really have in the same way we do, it's how we built civilization, is it comes with a lot of baggage and bias about short-term versus long-term outcomes and payoffs. Authority, there's often an official future that particularly as public servants we feel obligated to sign up for. And so a lot of strategic foresight is about how do we break down these futures into those categories you just suggested. One is we have to move away from the probable. So one thing we are very bad at in this kind of cognitive architecture sense is probability. We tend to treat a 40% chance of something happening like a 5% chance of something happening, and a 60% chance of something happening is a 90% chance of something happening, right? And there's a lot of studies demonstrating this. So one thing we need to do is we need to take things that are not that likely, but 30, 20% much more seriously, because they can happen, and across enough time they probably will, right? So that's what it means, engaging and shifting from the probable into the possible and the plausible. Right. The other part is that I would challenge anyone to 10 years ago have gone and articulated what has happened over the past 10 years in terms of
what happened in the last 2 days.
Right, yes. Probably while we've been speaking, right? There's been so much change that is that difficult to predict and caught people by surprise. And that's why I think even when people think possible, they're probably not stretching themselves really to think not just about certain individual events that might happen, but the kinds of futures that a combination of events might produce. Right? So that's usually a lot of the goal of structured participatory foresight exercises, is to push out those outer limits of what we think might happen so we're prepared for a wider range of contingencies.
I may be absolutely wrong, but it sort of feels like we might be a little bit better at doing this in our own lives than we might be in an institutional capacity. I'm just thinking through the pro-con lists and weird pathways and decision trees that seem to naturally form in anyone's mind around their own choice of partner, choice of job, choice of next sort of step in choice. I wonder, although we hold the same biases, am I imagining that we're better at it for ourselves?
I think it's not universally the case, but I think it is generally true. I mean, I know that when I come into the office tomorrow, I'm going to be thinking about the emails I need to respond to, how to get that next 5% ahead on the project. And if I do have time to sit down and do something, I'm not usually looking at those long time frames. But at the same time, I'm thinking about getting another car. I'm thinking about, should it be an EV or should it be petrol? And how old are my kids how big are my kids going to get? How much sporting stuff I'm going to have to lug around in it? And it would be crazy to me to buy a car, for me personally, anything less than a 10-year usage time frame, right? So I think that's definitely true for many of us. Part of it, I think, is also the difficulty of doing this, and it shouldn't be underrated in a professional context, particularly when we're working in government and we have something of an obligation to understand the big picture, because the big picture is so uncertain. And I think this is one of the reasons why we really benefit from using structured participatory tools like strategic foresight, is we need to partition that uncertainty to kind of manageable chunks. We need to be able to think about, for example, the future of the health system here in New South Wales in some proactive way that lets us make decisions without being overwhelmed by all the unknowns. I think a big problem is we tend to mix up, particularly in government, we tend to conflate risk and uncertainty a lot, right? We tend to think about things that can fall over and go wrong, and that is a big mental limitation on imagining the kind of new technologies, new social ideas, new changes that could open up new policy avenues. And that's one of the things I think we're more able to do in our personal lives and professional, is we're more open to the opportunities, not just the risks.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, there are no facts yet in the future. And as you say, we are, I think when I sat down to think about this topic, I might have got confused, I think, between foresight and forecast. And I was thinking about predictive models and went to the weather and all of these things. And I was thinking, well, how do we get away from sort of being channeled into what's happened before, and therefore that somehow limits our ability to think about the breadth of things? You know, you mentioned some of the biases. How do we crack open? Is it through these participatory tools that you speak of? And what is a participatory strategic foresight tool?
Good point. So first off, I think the first thing we need to do is surface all those things. So first off, strategic foresight is not divorced from evidence and the predictive models and trends and data, because obviously we've got access to this huge amount of data about the world today, and also this huge amount of historical information on what happened before. But we want to try and add something to it, right? And in futures, it's often about asking one of two questions. It's what if this thing happened, or it's if this continued, then what? And the way then we need to deal with all these, I guess, assumptions we have about the future is first by surfacing them. So an example when I talk about a structured and participatory exercise is is I might start, if I had a group of people, a team in New South Wales Health or a
Yeah.
group of external stakeholders, by saying, let's simply get down on a page what we all think is going to happen in the future. Just assume 51% probability this is going to happen, and let's do that. Let's put down our thinking behind, and sometimes that makes you realize this is a guess or something intuitive as opposed to something thought out, but you need to get it down on the page. And then what Futures generally does is it starts playing with the assumptions. What if this thing we think is true, or that history tells us is true, does not seem aligned with what is out there is telling us about what's novel? Because it's the one thing that history can't easily prepare us for, is the genuinely new and novel, right? So starting with this baseline future, we then start to say, well, if we adjusted these parts of it, how would it look different? And what would be the implications of that for us? Right now, for example, we know that Ozempic and similar weight loss control drugs have been expanding and accelerating at an incredible rate in terms of how many people are using them. And this is, again, goes back to asking the question, if this continues, then what? What happens if obesity is no longer an issue at all, anywhere ever? What does that do to which industries, to economies, to the health system? So you start there, and that might be the assumption of someone in the room. This is the way the future's looking. But then you play with it. Like, when does this trend top out and why? What if there's a social backlash to this? So you can easily get lost in these decision trees. So this is why we think about it being both structured and participatory. We need ways using the collective intelligence of the people in the room on one hand to divide this up into manageable steps so that we can actually get to a decision or a prioritization or an outcome. You just need to put structure around it. Otherwise, the conversation will go on forever. And it needs to be participatory because we've got such a wealth of information, knowing that the more diverse voices we bring into the room, the better our insights and outcomes will be. It can be the worst thing in the world is treating policy or the work of government like a group of white male experts in a room solving puzzles, which was the attitude perhaps for the last 150 plus years, right? We need people who are adjacent to the futures. There's a quote by the author William Gibson that the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think the point about that is you can go and find clues to what the future looks like all over the place in the kind of tools people are using, in the approaches and the ideas in young people's heads. But to access all of that, to get that intelligence out of the future, you've got to bring those voices into your process.
Yeah, so like we talk a lot in health about creating a shared vision as a mechanism for moving forward. But sort of what you're saying to me now suggests maybe the shared vision is an endpoint, but we actually need lots of visions, lots of potential visions. And I wonder if in this time of real polarization in society, an upside of the fact that we all seem to not have even shared facts is that we're going to hear some really different points of view and ideas. Can you see a possible win from what feels like a really tense time in society for people even sharing different views and ideas?
It's a really interesting point. I think particularly when we think about that polarization, I would tentatively put forward one thing that's creating this polarization is that perhaps we have lost a sense of communal strong visions for the future across most Western big economies, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that it has become difficult to find those big, sustaining, reforming visions of what positive progress and change could look like for people that they feel comfortable can be delivered and we can buy into. So I think it's both problem and opportunity for the current moment. I think we've got this issue that we do not have a common vision of what success and prosperity and happiness looks like. I think there are a lot of concerns about the current economic model that's been in vogue in much of the Western world since the 1980s, that the cracks have really started to show in that. There's been very good research that globalization did not deliver amazing outcomes to a lot of areas in the United States, for example, with the Rust Belt and other effects. So I think that's a huge problem driving this polarization. And as I said, to me, I find it very powerful, though, in a room where I've done work with local and state stakeholders, where there is this kind of polarization and division, to basically try and get people together to talk about what do positive outcomes look like for all of us and where can we find those common bits that we can start to build more positive visions of the future. I should note, though, this is where, and I don't want to... strategic foresight isn't a magic bullet. The thing is it always needs to be accompanied by follow-through, by strategy and decision-making, or else it's just conjecture and speculation, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this is the other really important thing for us as public servants and stewards of policy conversations, is that we don't just stop at having a conversation about what does a positive future look like, but we think about articulating the steps it might take us to get there.
I think we'll talk a little bit about that transition to action, but I wanted to get back a little bit to the piece around sort of bias. I think there's a bit of conversation around you need to be able to see it to be it. And I think from a policy-making perspective, I'm interested in the idea that if you can think it, can it be real? Like, I think we are, particularly maybe in health where there's, our risk appetite is low. We have, the trust and safety of the citizenry in our hands. And yet it feels very exciting and electric to hear you talk like this. And it makes me think about how we do create the space for the conversation about that piece that maybe would be a major risk to take, but is worth exploring. And maybe it's a risk that we can't take now, but having discussed it, thought about it, explored it, the opportunity will present itself in 5 years' time where the risk is diminished or the risk return has changed.
No, that's absolutely it. So I think, to me, often the analogy I use, it's like in getting government, a lot of what we have to do is scan ahead a little bit, then think about it like we're getting our surfboard ready to catch the right wave when the right wave comes, right? So my fundamental belief is we know we have to be prepared for a wide range of crazy stuff to happen. And as I said, I'm glad the health system has a low risk tolerance, because when I go to hospital, that's the sort of thing I'm delighted to hear.
Yeah.
But I think that the question really is, how do we get better at being reactive and responsive? And I think this is where it's about being proactive in the first instance and thinking ahead to the kind of challenges we're likely going to have to confront, makes us better prepared for them and able to act more responsively in the current moment, right? So and this is why I think moving outside this framework of risk, the problem is with thinking about risk all the time is that generally it's a problem-solving. How do we solve the status quo and get things back to normal, right, often? How do we keep normal going? But there is no normal. Normal changes all the time, right? So I think the first part is getting out of the risk mindset and is just simply acknowledging the fact that dramatic changes occur. Obviously, I was talking earlier about some of the biggest changes that have happened this century, and one of the possibly most defining ones has been the lifespan's increasing, right? And what that's done to our housing systems and our health systems and our tax systems and everything. And then we've got on top of that, not just the health span, but the well span, as well, in terms of how do we ensure that people actually have a meaningful life over their entire... So these issues, this has been a pivotal, massive change, right? Yeah. And I think asking what is next on those two trajectories, for example, is likely to be the thing that's necessary for us to have an effective health system in years to come.
Yeah, you're right. And health is a piece of that puzzle. Do you think Australia as a nation is risk averse? Like, do you think we're the lucky country? I'm sure that's not true for all Australians, but for a lot of Australians, the ageing housing, all of these things almost fit into a jigsaw puzzle together. But we have to, as a community, be prepared to sort of make a jump to some of these more novel solutions. And I just wonder, is the characteristic of the Australian sort of community, are we there? Are we on that? Are we prepared to take the risk?
So I do think that we are a lucky country in a sense, in that not only in terms of what we've got now, in terms of really strong prosperity compared to a lot of other countries and to ourselves historically. Now, inequality has been rising, and there are a lot of people who are not part of that. So as you noted, that's kind of important to acknowledge. But we are still quite lucky. And I think on top of that, we have all this other untapped resources, I would argue, in Australia. We could fit the entire population of Australia into Tasmania at the density of the Netherlands, right? So if we ever decide just to abandon the mainland, then that's a possibility. So we have this huge opportunity in terms of our agricultural wealth, our mineral wealth, the wealth of our people, our strong educational institutions. So the question is really, how do we leverage all that to take Australia to the next steps in terms of helping those who are not as lucky in the current system and ensuring that people have even more confidence where they see risk. I do think this is a problem, though, across much of the Western world in many places. And I think it's partially because some of the systems we rely on that were forged World War II or 120 years ago, I think are seeing signs of strain. So the cool thing is there are immense opportunities here through reform. I firmly believe, and this is, I suppose, me very clear, I'm talking as a citizen perhaps rather than even a government employee, Australia's like this close to being a utopia, or pretty damn close to it in terms of what we can do, because our advantages are enormous. And I think that's, to me, is a big reason why I'm keen and engaged in this space, is I don't see strategic foresight as simply scanning ahead for risk. I do see it as catalysing people to imagine stronger positive futures and assisting government to execute that. I do think it is a big challenge because you're right, people here have got a lot to lose. I mean, I have a mortgage, kids, but a lovely house in Canberra. I'm very lucky in many ways, and that immediately makes me frightened to lose any of it. I mentioned my kids earlier. This generates strong feelings of fear for me as I think of all the things that could go wrong for them over their entire lives. So this is, again, a reason why having structured processes and actually saying we're going to do something to achieve positive futures is important, because it stops us perhaps from jumping into the dystopian future. Oh God, the climate crisis, we're all going to be living in Mad Max style in 20 years, or the robot's going to come to kill us.
Yeah.
These are real concerns. Well, they're concerns by the images in our heads. That, we tend to tend either to utopian or dystopian visions of the future. And this is one of the reasons why our job is to try and bring that complexity back into it and say it's probably going to be some good things and some bad things. How do we navigate through that?
Okay, artificial intelligence. The average person wants to think of cool 10 names to call their band. They're now going to ChatGPT or something like that and asking as if the AI may have a more creative approach than the human imagination. I'm interested in whether you think AI can be a tool that can assist in strategic foresight, or is it in effect actually a detriment to the creativity of the human mind?
This is a terrible question to ask me because I have my brain telling me one thing and my emotion telling me another. So my emotion telling me is that we should fear and hate this thing, right? And I think this is shared by a lot of people who in surveys across the broader public are very concerned about what the AI could mean for their jobs, for their lives, for having to use it. So it's important to understand the driver, I think, of both mine and their concerns is over probably the last 40, 50 years, we've seen a lot of technological development, which has probably fueled a lot of inequality, and where the big returns, perhaps promised by some of those technologies, hasn't necessarily been seen by a lot of the population in the way that previous technologies, which were very labour-saving, again, I mentioned earlier, the fridge, indoor plumbing, international air travel, television, the benefits of those things were perhaps more visible than maybe Facebook and Instagram in some ways, right? Yeah. So to the broader swathe of people. So that's the fear part of it. My brain tells me that this will be another technology like many technologies where it's going to be very unpredictable what it actually does for us and how we can use it. I mean, when I'm old enough, ancient enough now to remember how I thought email was going to be a really great time-saving device, and yet I seem to spend an awful lot of time staring at my inbox of 30,000 unread emails, right? So I think it's difficult to know is it just how it's going to apply things. What I do know for a fact, though, is in the hard sciences and in health, there are amazing things being driven forth at speed because of the vast advantages they now have in terms of data and processing power. So I think there are huge things being done by specialists using AI in their fields, which just seem to be remarkable in terms of how that's going in genomics. And so I can see it on the specialist end. I'm a little bit more concerned perhaps about the broad base, and as you said, I think there are real costs to us using these technologies. There have been good studies showing how that people increasingly using Google Maps might be shrinking the hippocampus a bit because apparently some of their spatial reasoning skills, the things we use for navigation, have been baked into us since we were hunter-gatherers, and a lot of people are just automatically defaulting to using the phone to substitute for those parts of their minds. So I do worry about that. I worry about it in universities, for example, but I wonder if some of that worry, say for the universities and people, my kids might be using to write essays and not using their brains, might also reflect a bit about the inflexibility of our education systems and the fact that we're still teaching perhaps in a way that maybe was already old and broken. So how much is this actually changing things versus much like COVID did, just showing us the cracks in our existing systems? So it may also force these institutions to adapt, respond in more innovative ways. So that's a long, complicated answer.
No, it's a complicated question and it's a complicated issue. I often also think what is the awareness of our current society around the cost of AI from an environmental perspective? I think that's a sort of an unknown cost or to the average person who's a user. And I agree with you. I can see major benefits as an adjunct tool, particularly around information, and in the health professions, there's obvious applications for that. But it does, maybe as you say, it forces the jump for human ingenuity beyond, because we're going to need to go beyond. And I just wonder, it will just be a tense time until we've made that leap.
The really critical thing, though, is I think, and this is the part that is hard for people to grok, is that it's all within our control. Collectively as human beings, right? It's I think when a lot of people are concerned about AI, what they're really concerned about what companies and institutions outside of their control might do with AI that will hurt, damage. So I think the first thing though to acknowledge is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these things are not like meteors heading to the planet which we have no control over. We have a lot of control. Governments remain the most powerful actors in terms of shaping how these things can affect us and how we take advantage of them and how we mitigate the downsides. So again, I think what's really important, if I'm looking at this through a strategic foresight lens, is again highlighting the importance of taking a structured think about, okay, we know there are these issues, we have these concerns. How do we move forward from worrying about these concerns to thinking about how to tackle the downsides in a meaningful way? Because that is the role of government, I think, fundamentally, on behalf of us, the people.
So it becomes really important, the who's in the room having these conversations. If we agree that it's less about sort of predicting and more about shaping, we work in a political system where the people in the room change on a regular basis. How does that impact our ability to make those long-term strategic decisions? And can the regulatory mechanisms keep up with the pace of what's the change that's all around us?
What's really lucky is that we have a very well-regarded public service, both in the state and federal levels. It has introduced the federal level stewardship part of the APS values. So there's a recognition that we have institutions that really is what differentiates, right, I think, good performing countries from other ones is strong institutions. We have CSIRO, we have the ABC, we have our government departments, we have the states, who also have their own institutions. And I think that those are really important to basically make sure that whatever government of the day has access to the best advice possible on how we take these things forward. We have also other democratic mechanisms in terms of our councils and local governments, and we have other various NGOs. So we have a lot of mechanisms to interact and engage on these issues. I think what's really important, though, is that we find vectors to keep having these conversations in a healthy and productive way, right? Like the difference in social cohesion policy, for example, there's a set of rules you can kind of come up with about what does good social cohesion look like versus bad social cohesion. A bad social cohesion is like, let's kick out everyone who disagrees. Let's be an authoritarian state and have one answer, and that's how we're going to cohere as a society. We don't really want to do that because there's a lot of downsides to that approach. So positive social cohesion is where we acknowledge that we're going to deal with our issues through conversation and democracy as opposed to violence, right? And it acknowledges that things will change and we must be progressive. So that's where I think for me the answer is it's about keeping these issues live and ensuring that we again, coming back to participatory, that we're including as many people as possible in these debates in a positive, pushing forward, constructive way, and that will influence the political process. The government of the day is the way that we make decisions as a society, and I think our role, again, as public servants in providing the best quality advice involves us taking a bit of this long-term view, finding the space to say, Minister, government, we've got some ideas for you. Here's how they play out in the short term. Here's how they play out in the long term. And to do that, we have to have done that long-term thinking.
If we just lean into health for a minute, we're not the only sector of government or the community where we've almost been raised to deal with today. We're very responsive. There's the emergency that keeps coming through the front door. Our chief executives have a range of KPIs driven on the performance of the institution today. How have you seen or even other health organisations try to make this space, try to recognise the value and importance of the strategic foresight sort of futures thinking in an organisation so driven by the next emergency?
It is a real challenge. So I think there's two. When I say strategic foresight, I used to always talk about this really as a set of tools and processes that you can implement. However, over the course of my journey engaging with this in government, I think the other part of it is seeing it as an activity. And we can almost call this lowercase f foresight, like simply how much time do we as an organisation, as teams, as individuals spend thinking about the future proactively, right? And then the strategic foresight and various futures tools becomes the how can you do that, and you can find a tool and you can play with it. And if it's not working to get you what you need, you adapt, iterate, and so forth. But it's the strategic foresight and activity that is important, and that means actually taking time somehow and creating these conversations. That needs to be supported at a leadership level. So it does mean that you need to sell your leadership on it. In my experience, I find that whenever you say we need to be more strategic and proactive as an organisation, most executives in Australian public or state services or hell, probably the CEO of Coke, goes, yes, absolutely, we need to be more strategic and long-term in our approach. The question's often how do you then do it, how do you resource it, and how do you do it effectively? And I think it often, as many of these things do, comes down to people. You need to have a group of people with the right capabilities, experience and skills who can then help to catalyse that change across the wider organisation. NASA had a period when their moon program was flagging where there was a bunch of engineers who almost went rogue because they had this mission control system that had successfully landed people on the moon. And so people were very afraid to deviate from it for something new, right? Because it was tested, it was funded. And they argue there's 1,000 things we can do better. And what they eventually realized is NASA had to shelter these people inside their organization and acknowledge that agitators inside an organization who are frustrated with how things are, who want to innovate, who want to explore, have different risk tolerance perhaps, that you find ways inside an organization or even a team to provide a canvas and some time for them to explore those ideas. I think this works whether you're a startup, whether you're BHP, whether the New South Wales Department of Health, whomever, is your success at innovating and looking to the future and being creative acknowledges that not everyone's going to fit in the same slot in your organisation. And if you can create spaces for those kind of conversations to happen, supported by your executive, you get amazing outcomes.
It's one thing to have leadership buy into this as an area and devote time and energy from a strategic perspective to this space. How do you think we can bring the frontline workforce along on this journey?
So the coolest thing is that I find, particularly at the federal government level, working with people in service delivery, implementation, corporate areas, are actually further ahead on this sometimes than the executive or people are, because they see the problems on the ground. The other thing is, what I love, I used to work in the video games industry, right, for quite a while, and the people I was most jealous of were concept artists. So these are people who would come and do very early in video games development, big sketches of sci-fi cityscapes or dinosaurs eating people or whatever. But what I loved is they didn't care when the game was getting released often or what they were doing. Their job was to come in and draw every day from their imagination, and that's what they would be doing if they weren't being paid any money to do it. They loved it. They'd come in on the weekends. But what I really noticed about them is a sense of craft that they brought to their work. They came in and they were interested in how to do their job better. And what I see often in more frontline workers is a dedication to craft. They think about how to do their job better. And that invariably involves thinking about the future. What are they seeing that's changing? And they're often the first to see these issues on the horizon because they see the clues around them. So I would say often a lot of them are doing it intuitively and very well, possibly better than people more senior in the organisation. In fact, they may even be frustrated that it's not happening any elsewhere because they see the changes before some of the rest of us do. So I think in many cases, it's not asking simply how can they build more of it into their lives. It might simply be how does the rest of the organisation draw those insights better and that intelligence from those frontline workers about what's coming into the future. How can we use that invaluable knowledge of what is going on and what is changing and then mix it with some of the more technocratic data and evidence and things we have about global trends, right? And that's where the magic happens. So to me, that's part of the question, is simply how do we respect the fact that they're often craftspeople, who get better every year at their jobs, apply themselves to learning, because that involves thinking ahead and what are the future challenges the jobs can offer them. For those people, though, who do not have the opportunity to perhaps make space, though, again, I mentioned earlier that being better in the moment is sometimes about having had the time to think ahead a bit. So I think for those who use development opportunities or training as ways to do this, to lean into those opportunities through a training lens that allow them to spend some little time living in what the future of their discipline looks like. What is a nurse going to look like in the year 2035, or an aged care worker, or a teacher? Or I think these are valuable conversations to have. And as I mentioned earlier, they don't need to be, we need to spend 3 months examining this. It's a little bit more of the time, or it is simply about how you use your lunch breaks effectively when you socialise. Not to do work, but to chat about the stuff you clearly care about, because most of the people we have in frontline roles really care about their jobs.
Absolutely do. So we talk here, and I don't think we're unique, about blue sky thinking all the time. I read in your primer about black sky thinking. We've talked so far today a lot about what we envisage as a sort of a positive future. How much effort needs to go into preparing to avoid the things we don't want in the future?
It's a good question. And so just to give some context around this, a typical first exercise we run, and I'll come to that back to that second, I think you need to go beyond it, but the first thing you do is you'll simply say, all right, you've got a strategy or a policy or a plan, so let's ask what the most successful possible vision of the outcomes arising from this looks like, and let's look at the worst possible case. So it's not, and I think the important thing when we do this is we don't want to just think in terms of implementation of the initiative. You want to think of things even outside of your control that could go right or wrong. So the fascinating thing is usually when we do this with senior leaders, everyone is all over that black sky scenario, right? Because because it is such an important part of our job to manage risk, right? Yeah. So they go, oh God, this could fall over, or these stakeholders might turn against this, or the world might change in this way and this may not happen. And so blue sky actually, outside of a very vague motherhood statement, but actually trying to conceptualize what that future looks like in detail. What if we had a health system that ensured that was preventative, first, right? And what would that look like, and how would that change all of society? There's actually a lot of work involved in that. Whereas what does a broken health system look like is actually jumps to the mind of people, I think, much more quickly. The critical thing, you're right, though, is to put boundaries around some of this, because I mentioned before, our thinking about the future does tend to go either pretty utopian or pretty dystopian. Either everything will be fine, tomorrow will be like yesterday, but a bit better, progress, technology will march on. Dystopian, oh God, we're on the verge of falling apart, the housing crisis, the health crisis, the climate crisis, we're all doomed. So it is really important not for people to linger too much in these spaces. The important thing you want to do is you can bring it back to how do you catalyse action. And usually, because what you do after you identify a few, sometimes it can be with a big group of people, you want to vote a few black sky and blue sky, is you want to talk about the grey sky scenarios. And the grey sky scenarios more accurately probably reflect the future in that they should be a mix of the good and the bad. We accomplished 75% of what we meant to do, but then this other thing we couldn't control came in and spiked it. So, and that's a real critical part of the question is when you identify what has to go right for the blue sky to be achieved, and how do we steer away from the black sky scenario, the blue sky and the black sky, one we want to secure, one we want to avoid, then we need to think about all the things that we can't control and make those grey sky scenarios. The ideal plan will be one that points us towards the blue sky, mitigates the things we know and can see for the black sky, but then takes into account of some of those grey sky scenarios. That's the best one.
I mean, it's super challenging how you even cost effectively prepare an organisation to thrive in what might be 3, 4, 5 futures. I suppose, again, organisations are maybe intuitively doing this, but saying it out loud freaks me out a bit. Because
it does seem like a lot of work, right? And the sad thing is sometimes, this is the struggle sometimes, is sometimes you're coming in, not bringing in a fast, easy solution, you're bringing more complexity, and that to some people it's a horrible thing. However, what I should stress, and this is certainly in our primer, we reliant on the easiest, simplest to apply tools. I think a danger sometimes is people try and go, okay, we're going to take a year. We're going to get together 50 people. We're going to do the most thorough understanding of everything that could possibly affect the New South Wales health system forever. And then it's probably out of date by the time it comes out, right? So to my view, actually, a lot of these tools can be done really quickly, sharply. There can be even 2 people at a desk. They don't need to be 30 people. Like, it'll be better if you add in more viewpoints. They can be done asynchronously, where we have people in different states who are working remotely, able to chime in using structured interview processes, or there's a lot of ways we can do that too. The best thing is never you do this once and then it's done and now you're sold. It's about how do you bake it in a little bit as an iterative process that kind of complements whatever strategic things you're doing anyway. If you're not doing any strategic things, that's a whole other problem, right? But I think that we could sit down, even you and I, and over the next 2 hours, if we really wanted to, we could sketch out those blue and black and grey scenarios actually within that time frame, right? Just between the two of us, and then we could talk to some other people and get them to look at what we've done, and we do another pass, and it needn't be something that takes months. There is no way to get any of these answers right. Neither of us is going to articulate a vision of the future which is going to be 100% correct, because that's impossible. What we need to do is put down on paper our assumptions and our biases, and then try and just break them apart and diversify them a bit. And then our strategy and plans are going to be way stronger, because instead of testing them against one future, the one in our heads, which might even be different for both of us, so that's going to be a problem too. We've just tested them against a few different ideas of the future, and that inherently makes them more agile and robust. I mean,
the recent variable response at a global level to COVID-19 is quite interesting to have a look at. What do you think we learnt from COVID-19, and what do you think we didn't learn or we could have done better?
We're actually pretty good sometimes in a crisis. I think it's actually when governments sometimes at their best. And as we can critique individual things we did right or wrong, we failed to expect, we failed to prepare for, and I know there's a lot of amazing work going in to think about the next one of those. For me, though, right at the start of this conversation, we talked about the appropriate time frame. And for me, there's the interesting question is when we dial back a little bit and we ask maybe not just how do we prepare for the next pandemic, and that's critical work that should be a priority, right? Like we should be actively funding and resourcing people to think about that, and we do. The real interesting question is 2 things. One is, there's a book called The Viral Age, which says what if the next 10, 20 years are going to be 20 pandemics, right? Because all the conditions that enabled the spread of COVID-19 are still fundamentally in place. So what if it's not just an event, but what if it's a trend? That the nature of the global system makes these things happen much more likely. So we don't need to be prepared for the next pandemic. We need to be prepared for 5 pandemics with different characteristics over 4 years. Okay. Now, again, the danger is me predicting that, and that's not a good idea, but I think acknowledging that. So that's what I mean again about broadening out our thinking, but bring it to structural questions about what the future might look like. The second one is what I think was interesting about the pandemic was There were many agencies who responded really effectively and well. What is interesting is going and talking to the agencies who don't see this inside perhaps intuitively their space, like economic agencies, social agencies, defence. They will consider it through risk exercises. But obviously one thing the pandemic did is it didn't just have health implications, but it accelerated all these other things that are already in progress in terms of the move to virtual work. A lot of business models collapsed because we saw a shift towards digitization, which probably would have happened anyway, right? We've had these long-term economic scarring effects on young people who basically missed out on a lot of schooling and in university during these times. So I think the real trick sometimes, particularly in government, is how do we steer our thinking away just from what-if events, like an event which we have to deal with as a crisis for the duration of the crisis, but also be thinking about, well, if we had another pandemic, what would post-COVID-20 world look like, right? And I think, or post-next GFC world look like, I think is a really important question also to answer, because the real concern I have, particularly in this globally interconnected, complicated world, is the government's not going to be called on to deal with a crisis. They'll be called on to deal with multiple simultaneous crises, polycrisis, right? And there's still only a small number of people in a room in cabinet who've only got limited attention for when we may have a climate emergency, a health emergency, a national security emergency, all going on at the same time. That to me is because again, the future is never one thing, it's always several things happening at once. And we saw that again with not just COVID, but Ukraine creating these compounding supply shocks through the entire global economy, right? And I think that's the real question is how do we think about the kind of changes going on that also might help us be more adaptive to this kind of crisis? And we talked about AI earlier. How is that factor for these massive data centers available now for serious crunching going to change our next response to a COVID-like scenario, right?
Were you surprised at the bounce back after COVID? I just think the personal experience of many people was that there were learnings from that experience that they hoped would continue, and yet a lot of society has sort of bounced to pre-COVID, or maybe you have a very different view about whether we have or we haven't. But I'm just interested in whether you feel like we've utilised the lessons and taken the leap of progress in some zones and areas and built on that, or whether it's a standard sort of undulating process when we think about.
It's a really good question, because the question we have to ask is, had COVID not happened, how would today potentially look different, right? And the problem is because we're never in a static environment, the world is always moving forward and changing anyway. So we don't know really how much things may have been different had COVID not occurred too, in terms of evaluating what have we learned from it and what's changed. I do think a significant amount of things have changed, particularly in I think it demonstrated, for example, that remote work could function for a lot of organisations. And I think we haven't even really seen that play out to the extent it's going to play out in terms of what it means for our tax system, for example. If many Australians are employing people overseas, many people overseas are employing Australians in 20 years because we're all working remotely across our time zone instead of inside our country. So we do have a lot of these things, as I said, which COVID, I think, accelerated.
Yeah.
In terms of our learnings, I actually think within at least governments, there have been significant ones. I think one thing it certainly reminded a lot of the public was what the governments can do in a crisis and how much we rely on them for a lot of things, right? Because I think the Australian government and a lot of state governments did step up as across the world. And what is interesting is then to ask, has that changed expectations of what government can do since COVID? And has that been a new dynamic introduced in now that did it raise expectations? In the United States, certainly, they had many relief payments through COVID that only got cut off several years after COVID, and Biden wore the blame for that because they saw people's post-tax salary go down under his watch because a lot of COVID relief payments have stopped. So, and that has had big effects over there. So I think my answer to that essentially is, have we learned our lessons? Well, look, we're always going to have to learn lessons. The real big challenge, though, is the next time we have a pandemic or a similar crisis, the world will have moved on, so our context will have changed. So there's almost a danger.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, yes, in thinking that are we going to be trying to deal with it with a 2021 mindset instead of a 2028 mindset? I mean, this is why I mentioned AI. If we have another pandemic in 5 years, who knows how our data and AI capabilities will have changed by then? That might help us even faster with vaccine rollouts and public information and all sorts of things.
You've created this primer. I want you to tell people where they can go, who should be looking at it, and how we can be implementing it in health.
Sure. So I'm sure we can provide a link somehow
Yeah,
through the
we'll
notes,
put it in
but,
the
but,
show
if,
notes.
but you can just Google the Australian Government Futures Primer. It's hosted on the Australian Public Service Commission website. We developed it in partnership with the Australian National University's Futures Hub, and they're so number one for anyone in government. They're a great resource, and you can again Google Australian National University Futures Hub, and they maintain a network which meets quarterly of government people interested in foresight and futures. So that's something I would advocate listeners to sign up to and be involved. I think also this is something where I don't have all the great answers on this. Like the primer was something which I had seen. I only put in practices which we'd used pragmatically that we'd got good advice on. But there is an explosion of techniques and ideas in this entire space. There are amazing things happening. And if you simply Google futures thinking or strategic foresight online, you're going to get exposed to a lot of good ideas. And like one thing I would say is, when I'm doing a serious futures or strategic foresight project, I'm always customizing it for who's in the room, for the purpose, for what artifacts and solutions I get out of it. I'm always tweaking it and coming up with new ideas how to do it. So I think that is the mindset to go into this with, is I've got some principles laid out in the primer. You can start with that. But as I said, this is stuff that you can do by yourself. So I often ask myself, if I wasn't in the future space, if I go back to working in a much more conventional policy job, what would I do personally that I take from my years rolling this stuff out? And I definitely would do scenarios. When I thought about AI, I would, even for myself and by myself, I would take some of these approaches to say, here are 3 ways the world with AI could look like in 10 years' time, and just write it down. Because I'm confident that process will change my mindset. Because that's what has happened to me already, having worked with many agencies on many different futures projects, is it has fundamentally changed my ideas about the future.
Will, absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us at the Future Health Podcast.
Absolutely my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of myself and today's guest, and do not necessarily reflect the position of New South Wales Health. Any content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be interpreted as endorsement or approval by the organisation. New South Wales Health does not endorse any products, services or companies mentioned in this content.